I don't know who this is for, but I feel it in my spirit. Somebody walked in here today feeling like life has them backed into a corner. Like everything that could go wrong did. Like every time you take one step forward, something knocks you 2 steps back. And you're wondering, God, where are you in all this? But I came to tell you, just because the odds are stacked against you doesn't mean God isn't setting you up for something greater. Because the last time I checked, our God specializes in impossible situations. He takes the things that look like they're working against you and flips them in your favor. The question is, can you trust him when it doesn't make sense? See, the enemy wants you to think you're outnumbered, overwhelmed, and out of options. But what he doesn't realize is that God is not intimidated by odds. He's not sitting in heaven calculating probabilities. He's orchestrating your victory. And if you don't give up in the fight, if you don't let the pressure break you, you're about to see that the very thing working against you is the thing God is about to use to lift you higher. Are you ready for this? Because today we're about to shift your perspective and show you that the odds may be stacked against you, but God is still in control. When the odds are stacked against you, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, discouraged, and even defeated before you begin. The voices in your head start telling you that you don't have what it takes, that the situation is too big, too impossible, too far gone. But that's the moment when you have to remind yourself, God's power is greater than the odds. Think about David standing before Goliath. The odds were completely against him. A shepherd boy with a sling and 5 stones against a fully armored, battle-hardened giant. By human standards, there was no way he should have won. But David wasn't relying on his own strength. He was standing in the power of the living God. That's the difference. When you factor God into the equation, the impossible suddenly becomes possible. Many times we look at our struggles and only see what's against us. We see the financial burdens, the health crisis, the broken relationships, the career setbacks, and we think, how can I possibly make it through this? But what we fail to see is that God isn't limited by our limitations. He isn't bound by human logic. He doesn't look at your situation the way the world does. He looks at it from a divine perspective, and in his hands, the very thing working against you can become the thing that leads you into your breakthrough. In the book of Exodus, the Israelites stood trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's advancing army. The odds said they were done. There was no way out, but God didn't need a way. He made a way. With one command, he split the sea, turning their obstacle into their escape route. What looked like an impossible situation was actually an opportunity for God to display his power. That's the same God who fights for you today. The same God who stood with David against Goliath, who parted the Red Sea, who raised Lazarus from the dead, is the God who is standing with you in your battle. The odds don't scare him. The numbers don't intimidate him. The obstacles don't overwhelm him. He is greater than all of it. You see, the enemy wants you to focus on what's against you so you forget who's for you. He wants to magnify the problem so you lose sight of the promise keeper. But when you shift your focus back to God, you start to realize that no matter how bad things look, no matter how many odds are stacked against you, they are still outnumbered because God is on your side. So the next time you feel like you're up against something too big to handle, remember this: The battle was never yours to fight alone. God has already gone before you. He's already made a way, and his power is greater than anything standing in your way. Sometimes life knocks you down so hard that it feels like you'll never recover. The disappointment, the rejection, the loss, it all seems to pile up, making you wonder if you'll ever move forward. But what if what looks like a setback is actually a setup for something greater? What if the thing that feels like failure is really God's way of positioning you for a breakthrough? Look at Joseph in the Bible. He had a dream of greatness, but instead of stepping straight into it, he was thrown into a pit by his own brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. If anyone had a reason to believe life was working against him, it was Joseph. But what he didn't know in those dark moments was that every setback was leading him to the place God had prepared for him. Every betrayal, every delay, every injustice was part of the setup, because when the time was right, God elevated Joseph from the prison to the palace in a single moment. God often allows what feels like a setback because he is preparing something better than you could imagine. The job you lost, the relationship that ended, the opportunity that slipped through your fingers. It's easy to see those as failures. But what if God was actually closing those doors to lead you to something greater? What if the delay is protecting you from something that wasn't meant for you? What if he's strengthening your faith in the waiting so that when the blessing comes, you're ready to handle it? When Peter and the disciples were out on the water, the storm came suddenly. The wind and the waves threatened to overwhelm them, and then they saw Jesus walking on the water. Peter, in faith, stepped out of the boat. But as soon as he took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the storm, he began to sink. That's where so many of us are right now. We started strong, we stepped out in faith, but then life hit us, and now we feel like we're sinking. But even as Peter was going down, Jesus reached out and pulled him up. That moment of sinking wasn't his end. It was just a setup for a greater understanding of who Jesus was. God doesn't waste pain. He doesn't allow struggles just for the sake of suffering. He uses them to refine us, to shape us, to prepare us. The very thing you think is breaking you might be the thing that is making you. The things that feel like detours are actually divine direction. The closed doors, the betrayals, the disappointments, none of them are wasted. Because when God restores, he doesn't just bring you back to where you were. He takes you higher. He takes you further. He gives you something better than what you lost. Faith is easy when everything is going well, when the bank account is full, when your health is strong, when the relationships in your life are thriving. It's easy to say, God is good. But real faith, the kind that moves mountains, the kind that brings breakthroughs, the kind that pleases God, shows up in the middle of impossible situations. It's in the moments when you have no answers, no strength left, and no clear way forward that faith becomes the difference between sinking and standing. Abraham understood this kind of faith. God promised him that he would be the father of many nations, yet years passed and he and Sarah remained childless. Everything around him told him to give up hope. The odds said it was too late. But Abraham didn't rely on what he could see. He relied on what God had said. And because he held onto faith, even when the situation seemed impossible, he saw the promise fulfilled. That's the kind of faith God is calling you to have. The enemy wants to use impossible situations to shake your confidence, to make you doubt God's promises. He wants you to focus on how big the problem is so you forget how big your God is. But faith isn't about ignoring reality. It's about trusting that God's reality is greater than your circumstances. It's about believing that even when you can't see the way, God is making a way. Think about the woman with the issue of blood. She had been suffering for 12 years, trying everything, spending everything she had, but nothing changed. If anyone had a reason to give up, it was her. But when she heard about Jesus, something in her spirit said, if I can just touch the hem of his garment, I will be healed. That was faith. She didn't have a guarantee. She didn't have a backup plan. She just had faith. And when she reached out, Jesus didn't just heal her. He stopped, turned around, and said, your faith has made you well. Not her effort, not her resources, her faith. Faith isn't logical. It doesn't always make sense. Noah built an ark when there was no rain. Moses lifted a staff over the Red Sea before it parted. The walls of Jericho fell after people simply marched around them. Nothing about those moments made sense in the natural. But that's the point. Faith operates in the supernatural. The greatest enemy of faith is fear. Fear tells you to play it safe, to shrink back, to stay where it's comfortable. But faith demands that you step out, even when you don't have all the answers. Faith says, God, I don't see how this is going to work, but I trust you. And that kind of faith is what moves the heart of God. That kind of faith is what turns impossible situations into testimonies. That kind of faith is what brings breakthroughs when everything seems lost. Pressure has a way of revealing what's really inside of us. When life gets tough, when the weight of responsibility, disappointment, and uncertainty starts pressing down, that's when we find out what we're truly made of. But here's the truth most people miss. God doesn't allow pressure to destroy you. He uses the challenges, the struggles, and the moments that feel like breaking points to build something in you that comfort never could. Look at how diamonds are formed. They don't come from perfect conditions. They come from intense pressure and heat deep within the earth. Without that pressure, without that refining process, they would remain ordinary carbon. But because of the pressure, they become something valuable, something strong, something that can withstand anything. That's exactly what God is doing in your life. The pressure you're feeling isn't meant to crush you, it's meant to transform you. Joseph went through years of pressure before he ever stepped into his purpose. He was betrayed, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. At any point, he could have given up. He could have believed that the dreams God gave him were never going to happen. But what he didn't see in those moments was that God was using every trial, every moment of pressure to shape him into the man who would one day lead an entire nation. Without the pit, without the prison, he wouldn't have been prepared for the palace. Jesus himself went through pressure. In the Garden of Gethsemane, right before he was arrested, he was under such intense stress that he sweat drops of blood. He prayed, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. That's what pressure does. It brings us to a place where we have to decide if we will trust God even when we don't understand. And Jesus showed us that when we surrender under pressure, when we trust God even in the hardest moments, it leads to victory. Maybe right now you feel like you're under more pressure than you can handle. Maybe life has been hitting you from every side and you're wondering, God, why is this happening to me? But what if instead of asking why, you started asking God, what are you developing in me through this? Because pressure isn't pointless. It's producing something in you. It's refining your character, strengthening your faith, and preparing you for what's next. The truth is, God will never waste the struggles you go through. The enemy wants you to think that pressure means God has forgotten you, that the hardship means he has abandoned you, but it's actually the opposite. The presence of pressure is often proof that God is doing something deep in your life. He is shaping you, stretching you, molding you into the person he created you to be. The greater the pressure, the greater the purpose he is preparing you for. When God places his hand on your life, no force in hell, no opposition from people, and no circumstance can stop what he has planned for you. The enemy will try everything to block, delay, and discourage you, but he does not have the authority to override what God has already declared. When God blesses you, it's settled. No enemy can reverse it. No attack can cancel it. No opposition can overpower it. Look at the story of Balaam in the book of Numbers. The king of Moab hired Balaam to curse the Israelites because he saw them as a threat. But every time Balaam opened his mouth to speak, instead of a curse, a blessing came out. The king was frustrated and demanded that Balaam try again. But Balaam responded with something powerful. I cannot curse what God has blessed. That's what you need to hold on to. When God has spoken favor over your life, it doesn't matter who tries to come against you. They can talk about you. They can plot against you. They can set traps for you, but they cannot override God's hand on your life. Joseph's own brothers tried to destroy him. They threw him into a pit, sold him into slavery, and thought they had erased his destiny. But what they didn't realize was that their actions could stop what God had already put in motion. Even in slavery, Joseph was favored. Even in prison, he was elevated. No matter how many people tried to bring him down, God's blessing kept lifting him up. And in the end, the very brothers who tried to harm him had to come to him for help because God had positioned him in a place of power. The enemy loves to use people to try to block what God is doing in your life. Maybe you've been overlooked, rejected, or pushed aside. Maybe people have spoken against you, tried to shut doors in your face, or made it their mission to see you fail. But they don't have the final say. God does. And when he decides to open a door, no one can close it. When he declares a blessing, no one can take it away. Sometimes the opposition you're facing isn't a sign that God has forgotten you. It's proof that you're stepping into something greater. The enemy wouldn't be fighting you so hard if there wasn't something powerful on the other side of your struggle. Instead of getting discouraged, start recognizing that resistance often means promotion is on the way. You don't have to fight battles that God has already won. You don't have to waste energy trying to prove yourself to people who don't believe in you. You don't have to stress over whether or not someone can block what's meant for you. If God has spoken it, if he has blessed it, if he has ordained it, then no enemy, no attack, and no opposition can take it away. The difference between those who see victory and those who don't is not their talent, their resources, or even their intelligence. It's their ability to endure. Too many people quit right before their breakthrough. They give up when the pressure gets too intense, when the wait feels too long, or when the obstacles seem too great. But victory doesn't belong to the ones who start strong. It belongs to the ones who refuse to quit. Look at the story of the Israelites marching around Jericho. God gave them a promise that the walls would fall. But he didn't tell them exactly when. He simply told them to march. Day after day, they circled those walls, seeing no progress, no cracks, no sign that anything was changing. Can you imagine how frustrating that must have been? Some of them probably wanted to quit, to question whether they had heard God correctly. But what they didn't know was that their breakthrough was closer than they thought. On the seventh day after their final lap, the walls collapsed and they stepped into their victory. The problem wasn't that the walls were unbreakable. It was that they had to keep going until the appointed time. So many times we quit in lap 6 when our breakthrough is waiting on lap 7. We pray for a while, but when we don't see results, we stop. We pursue a dream, but when doors don't open fast enough, we let discouragement take over. But what if the very thing you've been believing for is just one more step away? The only way to find out is to keep moving forward. Elijah had to pray multiple times for the rain to come. He sent his servant to check for a sign of rain, and the servant came back 6 times saying, there's nothing. But Elijah didn't stop praying. He didn't stop believing. On the 7th time, the servant saw a small cloud rising in the distance. And that was all Elijah needed to know, that God's promise was about to be fulfilled. Victory isn't just about believing, it's about enduring. The enemy will try to wear you down, make you doubt, make you question if it's even worth it. He knows he can't take away God's promises, but he hopes you'll give up before you see them come to pass. That's why persistence matters. Faith isn't just believing when things are easy, it's believing when everything in you wants to quit. Jesus set the ultimate example of endurance. He faced betrayal, pain, rejection, and the cross, but he never wavered. He kept going because he saw what was on the other side. That's the mindset we need to have. If God said it, then it's worth holding on for. If he promised it, then it's worth pushing through the hard days. Your breakthrough isn't in the quitting, it's in the pressing. Victory belongs to those who refuse to let go, no matter how hard the journey gets.